Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. Laura Kortner is our executive producer, and Anita Brockington, our engineer. You know, over the past several decades, 21st Century Radio has explored the near-death experience, the between-life memory, and the issue of multidimensionality. As science and the mystery traditions begin to meet, ancient interests have gone into the laboratory. What does happen to the person after the body dies, and what is it that survives death? Is consciousness dependent on the brain? Why is it that some people who report having near-death experiences when their hearts have stopped beating had horrific experiences of things best characterized by Hieronymus Bosch paintings? Yet there are others who report of the feeling of love, union, and peace. Their near-death experience crosses all cultural, all religious boundaries, making it a human experience shared universally. Joining us this portion of 21st Century Radio is Chris Carter, whose book, The Science and the Near-Death Experience, How Consciousness Survives Death, an Intertraditions 2010 release, joins us to once again examine one of humankind's basic questions. Hey, Chris, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure, and your book is wonderful. Tell us how you got involved in this work to begin with.
Well, it really grew out of a lengthy debate that I had with a very stubborn and dogmatic skeptic. I was quite frankly shocked by his ignorance and by the crudity of his arguments, and so I decided that a book was needed to examine the evidence that the mind can function independently of the brain.
When you were asking yourself that question, was there something that had happened in your own life or something you had witnessed that made you ask that question? I mean, not everybody asks these questions in their lifetime.
Yes, but I've always been interested in controversial issues in science and philosophy ever since I was a child. I have degrees partly in philosophy, so I've been interested in these sorts of subjects.
Well, let's take a little look at the ancient history of the subject, because we come to it as the modern era, but it's something that has been part of humans' story all along. What did ancient cultures believe about this issue of consciousness after the death of the body?
Well, near-death experiences have been reported in cultures stretching back thousands of years. Probably the earliest is the story of spelled U-R, which was written by Plato sometime about 300 B.C. It's essentially a story of a soldier who apparently died on the field of battle. He was about to be burned on a funeral pyre when he woke up and told his story of traveling to the underworld and where he met people being about to be reincarnated. He was told not to drink from a certain river called the River of Forgetfulness, and he woke up on the funeral pyre and related his story. There's also other fragmentary accounts of the near-death experience from ancient times, from medieval times, but it was really in the modern age, in the age of modern medicine and modern resuscitation techniques, that the near-death experience became fairly commonly reported, with about, anywhere between 10 and 15% people who experience cardiac arrest reporting a classic near-death experience.
Yeah, I mean, your book is filled with fascinating summaries of research going on, even to show the difference, which we'll get to, between what people repeat who live in the Far East versus people who live in the Western world and have near-death experiences that are a little bit different. But what in general does the skeptic say when you start talking about, or any of us talk about, there being a non-locality consciousness, there being almost an eternal quality, although eternity, when you add that word, that really confuses it. But what do skeptics in general say about this?
Oh, there's a number of objections or counter-explanations to the near-death experience that I discuss in my book. I divide them basically into psychological explanations and physiological explanations. I think that I show in my book that none of those explanations hold up. So the near-death experience, in my opinion, is exactly what it appears to be, a literal separation of mind from body, when an individual is experiencing the early stages of biological death.
And because you talk about some of the different conditions that people say it's medically induced, it's too much carbon dioxide, there's things that happen from drugs or from anesthesia. Can we take a look for a moment? What interested me in looking at your book, because it's an area I've studied, as has my husband, all the 30-some years we've known each other and longer, but it seems that world religions impose a belief system, and I wonder from your vantage point how those belief systems affect the experience of the person having a near-death experience.
Surprisingly little. Near-death experiences are remarkably uniform across cultures. There are differences between the experiences, say, people in Europe and North America have, and the experiences that people have in China, Japan, India, various tribal societies. But there's a remarkable consistency between the experiences. The most universal aspects would be a sense of being separated from one's body, communicating with deceased friends and relatives, journey to another world, encountering otherworldly beings, and so forth. The culturally specific aspects would seem to be basically in tribal societies, in the Far East, certain Far Eastern cultures. There isn't the life review or the tunnel that's commonly reported in Western experiences. It's not exactly clear why this is so, but that's the way it is.
And those are, of course, the things that always interest me, is looking at what is dissimilar between the different cultures and why would a Westerner tend to have a life review. And I sometimes wonder, is it our movie culture? You know, it's almost like the mind gets used to doing certain things and it becomes habitual versus perhaps a culture that speaks in stories through symbols. I don't know. I'm really just sort of wondering about it out loud. But when you look at the different cultures' belief in reincarnation, does that seem to affect whether or not a person has a near-death experience or not?
Well, it's not something that I dealt with in my book, in this book anyway. I think the question that you asked was, does it seem to affect whether or not a person has a near-death experience?
Like let's say somebody who doesn't believe in reincarnation, they really think that their body is just a physical machine, as it were, in the Western model. Will they have a near-death experience?
Absolutely. A person's prior belief system seems to have absolutely no effect on the likelihood that they will have a near-death experience. It doesn't matter if they're Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist. It seems to have no, or atheist for that matter, it seems to have absolutely no effect.
And so when we then look at, and I'd like to take a moment to look at the science of it and what's going on in the laboratory. For instance, I loved, you had a comment from Ian Stevenson, who we've had on many times before he passed away, in a conversation he had on the BBC in 1976, where he posits that there's a non-physical process of storage of memory. So let's talk a little bit about this, because to me he's sort of seized on one of the primary perspectives that makes a near-death experience understandable.
Okay, in what sense?
Well, if there is a non-physical, most people think of our memory being inside our brain.
There's no evidence for that. There's been many attempts surgically to locate the source of our memories, where our memories are stored in our brain, and every single attempt, whether based upon animal research or based upon human beings. Obviously, we don't do experiments on human beings, but we can examine the effects of different sorts of brain injuries on people's memories. And every single attempt to find the location of memory storage in the brain has met with absolute failure, leading one researcher to write that memory appears to be stored everywhere in the brain, which is, of course, an untestable idea. Any idea which is untestable is unscientific. And so I have a chapter in my book called Are Memories Stored in the Brain, in which I detail this research and its utter failure to find where memories may be stored. And so I consider alternative theories that perhaps memories are not stored in the brain. Perhaps they are stored outside of the brain. Perhaps the brain does not produce the mind, and the mind is separate and interacts with the brain. And so I consider the research of my friend, the biologist Rupert Sheldrake.
Yeah, Rupert's been on our program over the years.
Okay, yeah, and he's put forward a very interesting model about how memories may be stored in morphogenic fields, which are fields which at this point are unknown to physics, and which the brain uses in order to store its memories. And if this is true, and I think there's some evidence to support his theories, that would mean that, yes, memories can survive destruction of the brain.
So if we look then, and it's certainly a topic we've looked at from many different perspectives, both within the mystery school tradition and modern quantum mechanics effort to describe what's happening, when we talk about non-local mind and non-local causation, allowing us to talk about consciousness outside the range of the brain, share with us a little bit more about the kinds of questions being asked and answered in order to address that. I mean, we've met with Ingo Swann and Dean Radin and many others over the decades in looking at how the mind can perceive things at a distance. How does that fit into your study of the near-death experience?
The first part of my book examines the relationship between the mind and the brain. And ask the question, does the brain produce the mind? But I think that the evidence indicates that the brain works as a two-way receiver-transmitter, sometimes from body to mind, as in sense perception, and other times from mind to body, as in willed action. The rival hypothesis that the brain produces the mind, I think, has been proven false by the data. And what many people don't realize is that there's a lot of evidence to this effect. And this evidence is examined in detail in my new book, Science and the Near-Death Experience.
Well, you've certainly done that in terms of bringing together all the wonderful studies going on, and it's a great contribution, and I'm so glad Intertraditions also thought it important enough to publish. When you look at the general materialist view of the mind, I think it's important to talk about that so that we have sort of two pictures that we can allow the audience to look at, because a lot of people sort of sit on the fence on these things, or they have personal experiences, but then there's sort of all sorts of ways in which they can describe it as being, oh, it was just a fluke. So let's talk for a moment, if you don't mind, Chris, about the materialist view of the mind versus the kind of non-locality mind near-death experience seems to support.
Okay. Well, materialism is an ancient philosophy that dates back at least to the ancient Greeks, to the writings of Democritus, who wrote that all that exists is matter in the void. Materialism is the idea that everything has a physical cause, and that therefore the brain produces the mind. The rival view, dualism, the idea that the mind is separate from the brain and the body, is probably even more ancient than the theory of Democritus, because it's found in all the old shamanic religions. And even the Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers, jewelry, tools, utensils, presumably for use in the next world. And that's the idea that the mind interacts with the brain, and that the brain is a two-way receiver-transmitter. So these are both ancient traditions, and in my book, I examine which one the evidence supports.
Well, and of course, then the other view. So if we're looking at two perspectives in a single sitting, the other is that the mind, like energy, is simply part of the fabric of, I guess we could say, the fabric of the universe through which we as humans and all life operate. I mean, how would you describe what then the other perspective is about where mind is and how mind works? If the materialist view simply posits that the brain does these things and it ends when we die, and that it's just sort of chemical phenomena, according to a materialist, the near-death experience is a chemical phenomena, or maybe an electromagnetic phenomena, but it's not a spiritual one. The other view of the non-local or the universal mind posits that mind is more like energy than the brain, meaning traditionally people think of the brain, the substance of the brain, the location of the different parts of the brain having to do with memory and balance and intellectual thought and emotions and those sorts of things, whereas a bigger picture of mind says, yes, it's all those things, but it's also something else.
Yeah, I wouldn't describe the mind as energy, not in the sense that physicists normally use the term, as the ability to do work. There's really no reason to think that even if all physical-to-physical causation involves the exchange of energy, there's no reason to think that, therefore, all physical-to-mental or mental-to-physical causation involves the exchange of energy. That argument was put forward by a physicist and philosopher, Charles Douglas Broad, many years ago, when quantum mechanics was still in its infancy. I also, in my book, I have a chapter called Physics and Consciousness, which discusses the relationship between the material and the mental, or the physical and the psychical, and it argues that modern physics is essentially supports a dualistic model of mind-brain interaction. In other words, that the mind is separate from the brain, and some physicists actually think that the mind actually may be an elemental property of the universe, as elemental as energy and force fields.
What has always interested me is how so many of the modern efforts to find a language to talk about these things have been spoken of in the native traditions, in the spiritual mystery traditions for millennium. I mean, so the phenomena is not new, and maybe with quantum physics and some of the other studies we're doing in light, perhaps we'll have a better understanding of how transference is done. I mean, when people have near-death experiences and they see somebody who has passed away 40 years earlier and they have a lucid exchange, people say, well, you're just hallucinating.
Hallucinations tend to be idiosyncratic. My hallucinations will not be the same as your hallucinations. But the near-death experience, there are no two near-death experiences are exactly the same, that's for sure. And there does seem to be some cultural influence on them.
Well, look, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about that, the cultural influences on near-death experience, as well as many other wonderful things in your book. Our guest is Chris Carter. His book, Science and the Near-Death Experience, How Consciousness Survives Death. It's an Inner Traditions 2010 release, and we'll be right back on 21st Century Radio.
Hello, this is Lisa Smart, author of Words at the Threshold. You can learn more about me and my work at www.finalwordsproject.org. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. Zoe is a well-informed and thoughtful interviewer. What a pleasure it was to speak with her this evening about the mystery and magic of final words.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Zohara Hieronymus. Our guest this portion of our program, Chris Carter. His book, Science and the Near-Death Experience, How Consciousness Survives Death. For anybody interested really in where the science is today, it's a beautiful compilation of studies with all kinds of statistics and descriptions of the various kinds of laboratory work going on. Again, our guest, Chris Carter, has a wonderful way of looking at it from both how skeptics look at near-death experience as well as what the research shows us. And I think, Chris, that's one of the things that's very unusual about your work is that you really do lay out both sides of the story so that an intelligent reader can look at it and really, I think, make some good, a good way of evaluating, if you will, if they haven't had an experience, what it might mean. Now, you said before the break that there are ways in which our culture imposes a structure, maybe, or at least affects the near-death experience. So let's talk a little bit about that. In what way? I mean, you mentioned earlier in the program a little bit of a difference that the Westerner has this tunnel experience. That's not always true, you say, in other cultures.
Yeah, Western near-death experiences tend to have, or more frequently include, description of a passage through a tunnel, and a life review. That's not so much found in near-death experiences, say, from India or from traditional societies, Polynesia and so forth. People from those cultures tend not to have a life review or describe moving through a tunnel. The reasons for this are not really clear, but there's a fellow named Alan Kelly here. He's a sociologist who has examined cross-cultural near-death experiences, and he thinks that it's basically because in the West and the Middle East we have historical religions, and in other cultures they may not have a religion which is historical, and so they don't place much of an emphasis on, reviewing one's behavior, or, With regards to the tunnel, he thinks it's basically because in the West we're more familiar architecturally with tunnels, so we're used to describing things in terms of tunnels or passageways, whereas in more traditional societies they don't have that concept. That's his explanation for those differences between cultures. But again, what most people would consider to be the most important aspects of a near-death experience, that is the experience of leaving one's body, perceiving it from above, meeting deceased friends, deceased relatives, otherworldly journeys. Those are the universal features of a near-death experience.
And of course, the feeling of peace and joy that people describe. I mean, in your book, or maybe you can take a moment and share with us some of the experiences you selected and why you selected them. I mean, there are literally thousands of stories. You can go on the internet today, or you can even turn on satellite television, and there's programs devoted to people who've had near-death experiences, what they encountered, and how it changed them when they return. But pick a few stories out, if you will, that you think stand out.
Well, one of my favorites from the book is probably that of the Apache war chief Geronimo. Shortly before he died in 1909, he dictated his memoirs to an interpreter, and he relates the following story. And I'm reading, these are the words of Geronimo. He says, "Once while living in San Carlos Reservation, an Indian told me that while lying unconscious on the battlefield, he had actually been dead, and he had passed into the spirit land. First he came to a mulberry tree growing out from a cave in the ground. Before this cave a guard was stationed, but when he approached without fear, the guard let him pass. He descended into the cave, sliding rapidly down its steep side into the darkness. He landed in a narrow passage running due westward through a canyon, which gradually grew lighter and lighter until he could see as well as if it had been daylight. But there was no sun. Finally, he came to a section of this passage that was wider for a short distance, and then closing abruptly continued into a narrower path. He continued to follow the narrow passage, emerging into a section beyond, which he could see nothing. The further walls of this section were clashing together at regular intervals with tremendous sounds, but when he approached, they stood apart until he had passed. After this, he seemed to be in a forest, and following the natural draws which led westward, soon came into a green valley where there were many Indians camped. He said that he saw and recognized many whom he had known in this life, and that he was sorry when he was brought back to consciousness." So that's the story of Geronimo.
Which is a story we have heard of, and it's just wonderful to share in this way. And when you look at the near-death experience in general, what are some of the after effects on people who have lived through them?
Well, the after effects of a near-death experience typically include, greatly reduced fear of death, increased belief in an afterlife, increased compassion for others, reduced competitiveness. Generally speaking, the experience seems to make them much nicer people.
And I know from the years of different interviews we've had with people who work with children who have had near-death experiences, they seem more mature than other children. They seem to know that they have a purpose and a mission. share with us a little bit about the change that has happened? Because, it used to be that it was parapsychologists who looked at this, or people who were ministers, or people who were in sort of an alternative spiritual paths. But as you started to mention a little earlier, it's changed in the last decade or so. Who now is looking at the near-death experience, and how does the change in population examining it change the field itself?
Most of the research on near-death experiences these days are done by cardiologists, basically heart physicians. There's a number of different studies that have been conducted in various emergency wards around the world. And the reason is basically because they're the best people who are positioned to research these experiences. They're constantly dealing with people whose hearts have stopped and show the signs of clinical death, namely no heartbeat, no spontaneous breathing, and fixed dilated pupils indicating no activity in the brainstem, the most primitive part of our brain that we share with reptiles. And cardiologists, of course, dealing with people that are being resuscitated from heart attacks, often hear reports that, reports of near-death experiences. And so many studies have been done by cardiologists.
I think the beautiful thing about that shift is that slowly, and you see it with hospice and people being able to actually experience the part of life that we all go through, which is dying, and that's a little different than the near-death experience. But some people have this near-death experience when they are close to even death because of illness. A lot of people have had near-death experiences through accidents or surgery that didn't go well. But some people have these experiences when they're close to death as a natural process of the end of a life. Does that seem to differ from the, gee, I'm in a car accident and now I'm outside of my body looking down on it?
Well, are you referring to people... What I think you're referring to is the so-called deathbed visions. Right,
the deathbed visions. Thank you. I was looking for the word, and I'm thinking, now, what is that called?
Yeah. Well, yeah, part 3 of my book deals with deathbed visions. Deathbed visions are experiences that people have when they are slowly approaching the frontier of death. Near-death experiences are usually caused or usually occur after somebody has had a heart attack or drowning or a suicide attempt, what have you. Deathbed visions typically occur when somebody is, say, dying of cancer. The two experiences are broadly similar. There's similarities between them, but the near-death experience appears to be a sudden shift into another world, whereas the deathbed vision is more of a gradual transition.
It's interesting because so many different traditions talk about the way in which the soul lets go of the body in stages, and we don't have time to go into that tonight, but I've always sort of wondered if at some point they'll be able to show the changes in some form of frequency shift, actual changes in the density of the body or the way the light affects the body. But coming back to some of the things you talk about, Chris, in your book, Science and the Near-Death Experience, I mean, there's these interesting studies. I think it's Michael Pressinger you mentioned, who has mimicked what's called temporal lobe seizures through electromagnetic stimulation. Why is this important?
Yeah.
That can be induced.
Well, Persinger is a psychologist at Laurentian University in Canada. He tries to explain near-death experiences as being due to seizures in the temporal lobes of the brain. Now, seizures are caused by abnormal electrical discharges in the brain, and seizures in the temporal lobes of the brain may indeed cause auditory and visual hallucinations, memory flashbacks, feeling of déjà vu, and more rarely even feelings of being out of the body. And so these seizures are thought by some researchers to be a cause of the near-death experience. So Persinger has mimicked temporal lobe seizure phenomena by electromagnetic stimulation, and he's boasted that he can replicate all the major components of the near-death experience. But if you look at his data, his claim is simply not true. the major effects of that his subjects report are actually tingling sensations and vibrations. And as I discuss in my book, in 2004, Persinger's research was dealt a serious blow when a Swedish team attempted to replicate his findings using equipment borrowed from his lab. A team at Uppsala University in Sweden tested 89 undergraduate students, some who were exposed to the magnetic field and some who were not. A double-blind protocol was used. That is, neither the people running the experiment nor the subjects being tested knew, first of all, what the experiment was testing, and second, whether any particular subject was part of the test group or the control group. The Swedish team also consulted Persinger's collaborator, Stanley Coren, to ensure the conditions for replication were optimal. So the Swedish team found no effect from magnetic fields whatsoever. The only characteristic that predicted what the subjects reported was personality. Subjects who were rated highly suggestible on the basis of a questionnaire reported strange experiences when they were wearing the helmet, whether the current was on or off.
Oh, well, that's interesting from a perspective of if you're doing the research and people without the input even there is having the experience is what you're saying, right?
Exactly, yes. So in other words, it was just power of suggestion. But the real question is, how closely do actual seizures resemble the near-death experience? And the fact of the matter is, they simply don't. In my book, I have a quote from a fellow named Ernst Roden. He's the medical director of the Epilepsy Center of Michigan and a professor of neurology at Wayne State University. And in my book, I quote him as writing, "The hallmarks and components of a near-death experience are a sensation of peace or even bliss, the knowledge of having died, and as a result, being no longer limited to the physical body. In spite of having seen hundreds of patients with temporal lobe seizures during 3 decades of professional life, I have never come across those symptoms as part of a seizure."
Interesting.
So in other words, seizures cannot explain the near-death experience.
Well, and you have some other sort of the skeptic's perspective, and when we come back, we'll touch on those just to be sure that we have an opportunity to really look at the whole picture that you so beautifully present, Chris, in your book, Science and the Near-Death Experience, How Consciousness Survives Death. Our guest is Chris Carter. You're listening to 21st Century Radio, and I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronymus.
This is Dr. Matthew McKay, author of Seeking Jordan. You can learn more about the book at seekingjordan.com. And you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronymus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. Don't forget, all of our guests are listed on our website, and after the program, give us a couple days, and the program's available as a podcast if you can't listen to the entire thing now. You can find us at www.21st21stcenturyradio.com. If you're just joining us, Chris Carter's our guest. His Inner Traditions 2010 release is entitled Science and the Near-Death Experience, How Consciousness Survives Death. And for anybody who's a skeptic, I'd say it's a great book to read because you can look at all of the sort of materialist scientific explanation, and then you can look at the actual data from real-life people who have a real-life experience. And Chris, I myself had a near-death experience when I was 3 years old, and I think when you have them young, well, at least for me, it really makes you look at the world very differently than perhaps your other school friends might be looking at the world. It opens you up to knowing that there's something more than the physical world or more than what you're being taught in school.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary even to have a near-death experience to go through those changes, though. I think just reading about them can bring about those changes, at least to a certain degree, in people.
Well, and I think that I have watched a number of times I Survived Death, I think it's called, or not sure. It's a satellite program. I saw it a couple of times, and there are these wonderful stories of people who literally describe what they saw, how it changed them. And, of course, many of them speak of not wanting to come back.
Yes. Someone could say, well, many of these people are sickly, they've had a history of heart disease or what have you, or they're very old, so it's not surprising that they do not wish to return. But there was an interesting case of a fellow. He was a 17-year-old seaman in the British Royal Navy, and he was electrocuted on board a ship. He was doing some electrical work, and he remembers waking up in a field of corn, and the corn was unbelievably yellow with gold and with green leaves, and the sky was blue. He remembers hearing soft music and then the rumble of a train approaching, and he remembers walking towards the train tracks, the train stopping, and himself getting on the train with many other passengers whom he did not recognize, and then traveling off somewhere, the train starting up. And then he remembers slowly rising out of his seat, and the next thing he remembers is being resuscitated on the floor of the ship. And he was 17 years old with his entire life ahead of him, and he didn't want to come back.
And I think from the many people we've interviewed, Melvin Morse and others and Ian Stevenson and others who have worked with children, I mean, they're very young children who not only have near-death experiences, but also who remember past lives. And it seems that as we as a humanity grow to appreciate that we are immortal souls having a physical experience, that all of the kinds of interdimensional states that native traditions have fostered and teach as a regular part of their life journey, the Westerner, with this hard, materialistic, scientific attitude that we have one life to live, I think that's what gets in the way for most people, is to believe they have a single life and all you get is what you get now, and that there's nothing more than what you see. I mean, it's interesting for me because I work in a very broad-minded spectrum of people. Given that 21st Century Radio, as an example, interviews the who's who of the new paradigm, we travel in circles where everybody believes in reincarnation or interdimensionality or non-locality or mind is outside the body. And so for us, it's a very normal part of our way of operating in the world and thinking about our life in this incarnation. But for people who have let's just say a narrower perspective or a more temporal view of the world, to have a near-death experience is a profound experience.
Yeah. Well, if you're referring to so-called skeptics, they're eager to debunk not just reports of psychic phenomena, but also phenomena such as a near-death experience. And I deal with this in Chapter 4 of my book. It's something that's peculiar to Western societies, and it basically has to do with a historical conflict in the West between science and religion. Essentially, as I argued in my first book, Parapsychology and the Skeptics, this debate is not primarily about evidence. The debunkers and the deniers are defending an outmoded worldview in which psychic phenomena are simply not allowed to exist. It's essential to realize that most of the deniers and the phony skeptics are militant atheists and secular humanists.
Oh, wait, I like that line. Militant atheist? I love that line. Militant atheists, and you said secular humanists.
Yes. Well, PsyCop.
Yeah, for sure. Very familiar with them.
They've changed their name to CSI, Committee for Scientific Investigation, or Committee for Skeptical Investigation, I'm not sure which. They were founded in 1976 at a meeting of the American Secular Humanist Society. And for various reasons, these people have an ideological agenda, which is anti-religious and anti-superstitious. One of the pillars of their opposition to religion and superstition is the doctrine of materialism. That is, the doctrine that all events have a physical cause and that the brain, therefore, produces the mind. If they conceded the existence of psychic abilities and of the near-death experience as a genuine separation of mind from body, then this pillar of their opposition would crumble. And this explains their dogmatic denial of the evidence that proves materialism false. So to summarize an answer to your question, the deniers and the debunkers are motivated by allegiance to an obsolete worldview, by ignorance of the implications of the new physics, and by hatred of religion and superstition. If they were to admit to the existence of psychic abilities and the near-death experience, then the foundation of their worldview would crumble. And they fear that the basis of their opposition to religion and superstition would be gone.
You know,
and
I sometimes... go ahead.
I just have to say, I think their fears are absolutely groundless. Surveys show that most scientists accept the likely existence of psychic abilities, and also that scientists enjoy considerable prestige among the general public. So society is unlikely to return to the Dark Ages anytime soon.
Well, and I think there's been so much research, whether it's through looking at random number generators where masses of people focusing their attention on a common event actually affect the fabric or the matrix, if you will, that influences a machine that's generating numbers, or when a number of group meditate that you can bring down crime, or, you know, we know now from so much laboratory work, or all the work that Rupert Sheldrake did in his wonderful book, When Animals Know When Their Owners Are Returning Home, or Ingo Swann and others who have done the magnificent work in remote viewing and actually being able to teach people how to use what Swann calls our bio-mind superpowers. See, I think that it's not so much that it's fear of religion. I think that skeptics are afraid, or not even so much afraid, but it's a philosophy of control. I think it's about dominating humans, not about freeing them. I mean, when I try to really understand why there would be a motivation in an entire community within the scientific community, or in the parasite, or in the psychological community, or in some other, to try to persistently say that those things we know are true, that we can see at a distance, that we can feel at a distance, that we can even see, as my dowsing teacher used to say, everywhere and every when. I think what they're afraid of is neither an issue of superstition or religion. I think it's about power over human consciousness. I think it's more nefarious than just a worldview.
No, I can't really agree with that, and Rupert Sheldrake would certainly disagree. Most of his critics are militant atheists. There's a unfortunately...
So you're suggesting then it comes because they don't believe in anything outside of themselves. They are it. They're the big honcho in the universe.
I'm not sure I'd express it that way. I think it's due to historical conflict between religion and science. And I mean, let's face it, we have had the Inquisition. We've had witch hunts. We've had the wars of religion. And we also, even today, there's a cultural war going on in the United States between the religious right wing, who influence a lot of American politics, and between their counterparts, the militant secular humanists. And unfortunately, we've got this schism in our society.
Well, and with that, I certainly agree, and it's unfortunate that we can't just be all-inclusive and say that, you know, a human is entitled to have their experience in the world and have it the way they're having it. And as long as somebody else isn't doing injury or harm to another person or their property, get off it. I mean, that's my vantage point. So when you look then at all of this, why is this so important to you? Enough that you address the skeptics, you look at their literature, you understand their perspective, and then at the same time you look at the beautiful research going on by very serious, committed scientists on the other side of the street who say, yes, near-death experiences are real, they're universal, they go across all religious and cultural lines. I mean, why is this important to you?
I suppose I'm trying to do my part to contribute to human civilization. I hope that doesn't sound too pretentious, but I guess that's what a lot of writers are trying to do. Another reason for the so-called, another motivation of the so-called skeptics is really an allegiance to an obsolete physics. Mm-hmm. Because the ancient doctrine of materialism, which, as I said earlier, dates back, at least to Democritus in ancient Greece, it was merely considered a philosophy until Isaac Newton came along, and then his physics were thought to support the ancient doctrine of materialism, because Newtonian physics is deterministic and observer-independent, unlike modern physics, which is indeterministic and observer-dependent.
And we also know from the observer effect that what we look at is affected by sheer looking at it. So, look, we are out of time, Chris, and I want to thank you. Is there a website I'm not aware of we can send people?
Well, sure. My book has a website, and it's titled the same as my book, so it's www.scienceandtheneardeathexperience.com.
Very good. Chris Carter's book, again, Science and the Near-Death Experience. Go to that address, .com. It's an Intertraditions 2010 release, and if you can't remember that, you can find it at our website, www.21st21stcenturyradio.com.